So the summer of 2009 started out like any other for me. I was working, going to university, something I did every single summer, but something was different this time. I felt like I was coming down with some sort of virus. I was going to work, going to school, but then going to sleep. I had no energy to do anything. I was thirsty. I was losing a lot of weight. And I kind of just chalked it up to the weight loss program that I was doing because like any other 20-something, I was on yet another diet. And of course, the thirst was just me staving off hunger. But then one day at work, I felt a little woozy, and I almost passed out. I've never actually passed out before in my entire life, so I knew something was wrong. So at the time, I didn't have a primary care physician or health insurance, so on July 6, 2009, I headed to the ER. While in the waiting room, I went unconscious several times. When I finally saw the doctor, he took some blood, drew some tests, and then I just, once again, went unconscious in the ER bed for several hours. When he came back to see me, he said to me, "Why aren't you taking care of your diabetes?" And I looked at him completely stunned, and I was like, I don't have diabetes. We actually argued about this for a long time, and then he finally eventually accepted that this was a totally new diagnosis for me. And it turns out that what I was experiencing is something known as DKA, or diabetic ketoacidosis, which basically means that my blood sugar was so high that day that my blood had become acidic in my own body. So 80 to 120 is normal blood sugar. My blood sugar that day was almost 700. If I had waited even one more day, I would have experienced organ failure, brain damage, or I could have just died. So I was immediately admitted to the hospital, put on insulin and fluids through an IV. By day 3, I had stabilized. I don't remember the first 2 days because I was still unconscious. And by day 5, I was released. I was given a few vials of insulin, some syringes, and a blood glucose meter. But this is the world that I entered into. It's a world that thinks that hashtag diabetic coma, which gets used 10 to 12,000 times per day on Instagram, is perfectly represented by a hot fudge sundae, when a diabetic coma is actually DKA. It's a world that thinks hashtag diabetes on a plate is perfectly represented by chocolate cake, when chocolate has actually saved me, a diabetic, on more than one occasion. It's a world that also thinks that enjoy diabetes, or Wilford Brimley has diabetes, or likes to talk about math problems about how many candy bars Bob has, are hilarious. All of these rely on one big assumption, that sugar causes diabetes, when in reality, there's no direct causal relationship between diabetes and sugar, at all. So if sugar doesn't cause diabetes, what does? It's very simple. Genetic predisposition. Everything you think you know about diet and exercise being the cure-all for diabetes is completely wrong. The other thing that you're also wrong about is that diabetes is not this big, huge monolith. There are actually 6 types. Type 2, which is insulin resistance, is the largest population in the United States, accounting for 28 million people and 90% of the diabetic population. Type 1 and 1.5, which is the autoimmune form, is 5% of the diabetic population and 1.25 million people. Type 3, which is actually being posited as Alzheimer's disease, and MODY, which is a genetic mutation, and gestational diabetes, which is insulin resistance that occurs during pregnancy, is the rest of the diabetic population. So what kind do I have? I have type 1. So this is the autoimmune form, the 1.25 million of us. That's 1 million adults and 250,000 kids. So basically what this means is that my immune system is launching a continuous attack on my insulin-producing beta cells in my pancreas. I don't have the ability to produce insulin on my own. I have to inject it to live. Type 1 is also a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act. A disability is simply defined and is an impairment that limits life activity. If I don't stand in for my pancreas, my life activity just ceases, so disability. But here's the thing. My disability is completely invisible to you. Unless I tell you, you have no idea I have it. So you have no idea that my speech may be slurring, or I might be acting a little angry, or my thought process might be a little off because my blood sugar is high. Because excess blood sugar in the body means excess blood sugar in the brain, too. You also wouldn't know that I could be acting drunk, or passing out, or experiencing seizures because my blood sugar is low. And this can actually kill me in a matter of minutes. So it's actually better if you know. But when you do know, you say some really interesting and actually sometimes offensive things to me. And that's what I want to focus on today. So here's some of what you say to me. And this is normally the first one that I get. Well, why didn't you grow out of it? I understand this one because type 1 used to be called juvenile diabetes. And so most people associate it with kids, but the rate of diagnosis is actually 50-50 between kids and adults. The other thing on this is people think that type 1s grow into type 2, as if it's a continuum. Type 1 is for life. And we actually really mean for life. We get medals for surviving this disease. In 2013, the Joslin Center awarded Spencer Wallace a medal for living with this disease for over 80 years. He was diagnosed in 1931, barely 10 years after insulin was invented at the age of 8. I will get my first medal in 2019 for surviving for 10 years. And when I say for life, I mean for life. There is no cure. So if you see that little meme on Facebook about how cinnamon or okra water or apple cider vinegar will cure me and you want to share it with me, please don't. The other thing that I get is, well, why haven't you regulated it yet? Or why are you not managing it better? So food, stress, exercise, sex, everything affects my blood sugar. A lot of type 1s will actually say, well, so does the color of my shirt and whether or not Mercury is in retrograde. We can literally do the same thing every single day and get different numbers. And we know this because we've tested this theory. This is actually me doing the same thing 2 days in a row. I have no idea what happened. The only thing I could chalk this up to is apparently Mercury wasn't retrograded enough. Well, you shouldn't have eaten so much sugar as a kid. Once again, no direct causal relationship between sugar and diabetes. And I get that I was diagnosed at the age of 25, so I had 25 years of lifestyle choices to make before my diagnosis. But what about her? This is Ava. She was diagnosed with type 1 at the age of 18 months. What would she have eaten to be diagnosed at 18 months? How many lifestyle decisions did she actually make before she got diagnosed? Speaking of food, well, you can't eat that. We have a saying in the type 1 community. The only things that I cannot eat are poison and cookies with poison. Everything we eat is a complex math equation. No food is better than any other food, and I'm going to have to do math anyways. And I mean some serious math. This is just basic carb counting for spaghetti with some sauce, breadsticks, popsicle, and a drink. And sometimes we do something called the total available glucose system, which is carb counting plus half the protein and 1/10 of the fat. And this is just one equation. We also have things where we look at our current blood sugar and our target blood sugar. So basically, type 1s as a group would humbly like to request honorary degrees in mathematics. The other thing we'd like to request is that you stop trying to give us sugar-free food. Sugar alcohol still has carbs, and we take insulin to cover carbs. So we're still going to have to take insulin for it anyways, and I don't know if you've had sugar-free food, but it's really gross. Oh, but I could never take all those shots. I kind of have to, or I die. There's no choice here. The good news is we've had a lot of advances in technology. That's the first insulin pump from the 1960s. It was the size of a backpack. Insulin pumps now look like pagers. The artificial pancreas system is actually moving into smartphone technology. But even insulin pumps have problems of their own. So this is actually my insulin pump system. My little pod is in the corner there. Even though this pod keeps me alive, it drives the TSA nuts. Every time I go to the airport, I have to request a pat down to get through security. I actually remember my best friend Holly crying tears of anger as she watched the TSA, as she said, violate me to get through airport security. But as any type 1 knows, this is just part of living with the disease. This is just what we go through. The other problem with insulin pumps are failures. So on the left is a reservoir for a tubed pump. As a 12-year-old girl slept, the reservoir cracked, and she woke up with a blood sugar of 600. She spent 4 days in the hospital in DKA. On the right is what happened when my insulin pod leaked while I was sleeping. Fortunately, my mother woke me up, but by that time, I had 398 for my blood sugar. It took 9 hours for me to stabilize. When I hear of an adult type 1 dying, One of the reasons is often pump or pod failure while they're sleeping. The other problem with insulin pumps, cats and dogs. No joke. So that's Cocoa Bean and his boy Owen, and that's also the insulin pump tubing that Cocoa Bean chewed through while Owen was still wearing it. And that's my little girl River, who likes to try to pull the pod off my arm while I'm sleeping. She's only been successful once, fortunately. But you don't look like a diabetic. There's an implicitness with this statement. What you're actually saying is, I don't look like the misunderstanding of type 2 diabetes in your head because you're thinking of obesity. The other problem with this statement is when you say things like you don't look like a diabetic, you're also saying you don't look disabled. And you're also saying you don't look like this and that, and these services that we need to survive can get denied, and it can cause discrimination. One area this causes discrimination in, service dogs. That's my Xavier. He's my diabetic alert dog. He has one job. Blood sugar gets too low, he wakes me up in the middle of the night, because no matter how hard I try, I can't wake up to a diabetic alarm. On the right is Ava, all grown up, 12 years old now, with her diabetic alert dog, Bruin. Bruin is a full public access service dog, so he alerts to highs and lows, and he goes to school with her. Now, in my case, I was almost evicted from an apartment because Xavier is a very scary pit bull type dog. And they wanted proof that I was disabled and proof that my disability actually merited a service dog. In Ava's case, when she goes to take Bruin into public places, they don't believe she's disabled at all because she doesn't look disabled. They're looking for some sort of mobility issue. So, sounds familiar, right? You don't look disabled, you don't look like a diabetic. Both of these are violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, by the way. The other issue is kids in school. This is Gavin and Diana. Now, when you say you don't look like a diabetic, you're saying that you have a general misunderstanding of type 2, which actually puts type 1s in danger. They had to be pulled from school because they weren't receiving the care that they needed in terms of administering insulin and managing their insulin pump. So Gavin and Diana, with the help of their moms, actually got legislation passed in Virginia that will allow trained school nurses to help type 1 kids manage their type 1, including changing pump sites, which can be essential in an emergency. So the idea of you don't look like a diabetic, we're now transitioning to what a type 1 needs as opposed to the assumption of what a type 2 needs. Now there's one phrase that no type 1 ever wants to hear, but it's the one that we hear constantly. It could be worse. I'm going to tell you a few stories, and I hope that after you hear these stories, you will never say this to a type 1 ever again. About 40% of all types 1s, when we are diagnosed, we do so in DKA, which means that we often die during diagnosis or due to misdiagnosis. Now, this first story is a little bit different because he didn't die. But it could be worse, except type 1 can change a family forever. This is Lane, Jacob, and Ty, who were 18, 16, and 14 at this time. Lane had gone to the doctor, and he had an abnormally high blood sugar that was never followed up on. Lane was driving his brothers to his dad's house when he went unresponsive and drove into a culvert at 82 miles per hour. Both Lane and Ty coded before they even reached the hospital. They were revived, but Ty is now a paraplegic. Lane suffered a brain injury, multiple strokes, and had to relearn to walk. The accident happened on November 8th. He was officially diagnosed with type 1 a week later. So it could be worse, except a regular day out can turn into a medical emergency for a type 1. This is Parker and his mom, Jen. They went to New York City. They were on the Times Square subway station when Parker's blood sugar went so low that he went into a seizure. They were with another type 1 family that day, which actually amounted to 4 type 1 kids and a very supportive sibling. With this family, the New York City Police Department, and a doctor who happened to be on the subway platform that day, Parker lived. But it took 20 minutes of treatment on that platform, 45 minutes in an ambulance, and 9 hours in the hospital before they declared him stable. So it could be worse, except a regular illness is not the same for type 1s. This is Nicholas. He had a sore throat and a cough. He ended up in the hospital in DKA over something non-type 1 kids might miss a day of school for. So it could be worse, except we have something called dead in bed syndrome. Basically, when we go to sleep at night due to injected insulin or due to just natural body function, our blood sugar can drop so low that we can go unconscious, experience a seizure, or just die. And if we manage to wake up to treat ourselves, we could not physically function and die anyways in the process. And Night Scout was basically a bunch of parents who said, we're tired of waiting. We're tired of waiting for the tech companies to do something about this, to create something that can monitor our kids while they sleep. So they hacked diabetes. All the screenshots that you've seen throughout this presentation of my blood sugar are from projects they created, that they have done on their own. They have provided me with the ability to monitor my blood sugar on a smartphone and a Pebble watch for the last 2 years. The leading diabetes tech company, Dexcom, still has not given me that ability. They have created their own artificial pancreas system known as OpenAPS. They've done that for about the last 6 months to a year. Medtronic will release their first this summer. They are already ahead of the game because they got tired of waiting. They will end dead in bed syndrome before anybody else. So the next time that you think it could be worse, remember this. Type 1s are the only group of people who make our own dosing decisions. And we do this all day, every day with a drug that can kill us in an instant. And we have to do it while we sleep. So here's my call to action to you. The next time Saturday Night Live makes a joke that McDonald's has 2 new Big Macs, one for each type of diabetes, or Fuller House says that they're going to hand out raisins and pamphlets on juvenile diabetes for Halloween, or the next time you see an Instagram hashtag or a meme on Facebook, each time this proliferates, the myths about my disease continue, and we continue to die because no one wants to fund a cure. But now you know better. And once you know better, you can do better. And you can tell people the truth about this disease. It is estimated that in 2050, 5 million people in the United States will have type 1, including 600,000 children. But we can end this. We can find a cure, but you have to be willing to educate with us because we've been doing this on our own for far too long. Thank you.